identity of appearance and existence with it, can it be considered as the absolute, the being of the percepi. It seems that we have arrived at the goal of our inquiry. We have reduced things to the united totality of their appearances, and we have established that these appearances lay claim to a being which is no longer itself appearance. The percepi refers us to percepiens, the beings which has been revealed to us as consciousness. Thus we have attained the ontological foundation of knowledge, the first being to whom all appearances appear, the absolute in relation to which every phenomenon is relative. This is no longer the subject in Kant's meaning of the term, but is the subjective itself, the eminence of self in itself. Henceforth we have escaped idealism, for the latter being is measured by knowledge which subjects it to the law of duality. There is only known being. It is the question of the thought itself. Thought appears only through its own products. That is, we always apprehend it only as the signification of thoughts produced, and the philosopher in quest of thought must question the established sciences in order to derive from them a condition of their possibility. We, on the other hand, had prehended a being which is not subject to knowledge and which founds knowledge, and thought is definitely not given as representation of signification of expressed thoughts, but which is directly apprehended such as it is, and this mode of apprehension is not a phenomenon of knowledge, but is the structure of being. We find ourselves as present the ground of phenomenology. First, although Husserl himself has not always been faithful to his first intuition, as we are satisfied, we have encountered the transphenomenal being, that is actually the being to which the phenomenal being refers. Is it indeed the being of the phenomenon? In other words, is consciousness sufficient to provide the foundation for the appearance qua appearance? We have extracted its being from the phenomenon in order to give it to consciousness, and the anticipated consciousness would be subsequently restored to its phenomenon. In the possible, we shall find or answers the examination of the ontological exigencies of percepi. And let us not note the first there is not being a thing perceived as perceived. Even if I wish to reduce the table to a synthesis of subjective impressions, I must at least remark that it reveals itself qua table through the synthesis, as it is the transcendent limit of the synthesis. And the reason for it is that it's in the table is before knowledge, and it cannot be identical with the knowledge which we have of it, otherwise would be consciousness, i.e. pure immanence, and it would appear as table for the same cause, even if a pure distinction of reason is to sever the table from the synthesis of subjective impressions, which I apprehended, at least it cannot be synthesis. That would be reduced to its synthetic activity of connection. Insofar as the known cannot be reabsorbed into knowledge, we must discover for it a being. This is being, we are told, as the percepi. Let us recognize, first of all, that the being of the percepi cannot be reduced to that of the percepiens, i.e. to the consciousness, any more than the table is reduced to the bond of representation. At most, we can say that the relative to this being this relativity does not render unnecessary an examination of the being of percepi. Now, the mode of percepi is the passive. If then the being of the phenomenon resides in the percepi, the being is passivity. Relativity and passivity, such are the characteristic structures of the esse, is so far as reduced to the percepi. What is passivity? I am a passive when I undergo a modification of which I am the origin. That is neither the source nor the creator. Thus my being supports a mode of being of which is not the source. Yet in order for me to support it, it is still necessary that I exist. And due to this fact, my existence is always situated on the other side of passivity. The support aspect passivity, for example, is a conduct which I assume and which engages my liberty as much as to reject resolutely if I am to be for always the one who has been offended. I must persevere in my being, that is, I myself assume my existence, but all the same I respond on my own account in some way. I assume my offense. I cease to be passive in relation to it. Hence we have the choice of alternatives. Either indeed I am not passive in my being, which I cause a case I become the foundation of my affections, even if at first I have not been the origin of them, or I am affected with the passivity in my very existence. My being is received being, and hence all falls into nothingness. Thus passivity is in a double relative phenomenon relative to the activity of the one who acts and to the existence of the one who suffers. This implies that passivity cannot affect the actual being of the passive existence. It is a relation of being to one another being, and not of one being to nothingness. It is impossible that perceptory affects the perception of a being. For, in other words, for the perceptum to be affected and would be of necessity have to be already given in some way and exist before having received being. One can conceive of a creation that on condition that the created being recover itself, tear itself away from the creator in order to close in on it itself immediately and assume its being. It is in the sense that the book exists distinct from its author, but if the act of creation is to be continued indefinitely, if the created being is to be supported even in the innermost parts, it does not have its own independence. If it is itself only nothingness, then the creature is in no way distinguished from its creator. It is absorbed in him. We are dealing with a false transcendence, and the creator cannot have even an illusion of getting out of the subjectivity. Furthermore, the passivity of the recipient demands an equal passivity on the part of the agent. This is expressed in the principle of action and reaction, and is because my hand can be crushed, grasped, cut, that my hand can crush, cut, and grasp. What element of passivity can we assign to perception, to knowledge? They are all activity, all spontaneity. It is precisely because it is pure spontaneity, because nothing can get a grip on it, that consciousness cannot act upon anything. Thus, the essay as percepi would require that consciousness be a pure spontaneity, which cannot act upon anything. Give being to a transcendent nothingness at the same time but keeping in its state of nothingness. So much nonsense. Husserl has tried to the gnosis, that is the Heil of pure flux of experience in the manner of passive synthesis, but he has only added an additional difficulty to those that which I have mentioned. He has introduced, in fact, these neutral givens, the impossibility of which we have shown earlier. To be sure, these are not contents of consciousness, but they remain only so much as the more unintelligible. The Heil, in fact, could not be consciousness, for it would disappear in translucency and could not offer that resisting basis of impressions which must be surpassed towards the object, but it does not belong to consciousness. Where does it derive its being and its of things in the subjectivity of thought? Its essay cannot come to it from a percepi, since it is not even perceived, for consciousness transcends it towards the objects. But if the highly derives its being from itself alone, we meet once again the insoluble problem of the connection of consciousness with existence independent of it. Even if we grant Husserl that there is a hyalactic stratum for the gnosis, we cannot conceive how consciousness can transcend the subjective towards objectivity in giving the how both the characteristics of a thing, the characteristics of consciousness. Husserl believed that this facilitated the passage from the one to the other, but he succeeded only in creating a hybrid being which consciousness rejects and which cannot be part of the world. Furthermore, as we have seen, the percepi implies that the law of being a perceptum is relativity. Can we conceive that the being of the thing known is relative to the knowledge? What can the relativity of being mean for an existent, if not the existent has its own being in something other than in itself? That is, in an existent which is it not. Certainly, it would not be inconceivable that a being should be external to itself if one means that this being is its own externality. But such is not the case here. The perceived being is before consciousness. Consciousness cannot reach it, and it cannot enter into consciousness as the perceived being is cut off from consciousness. It exists cut off from its own existence. It would be no use to make of it an unreal in the manner of Husserl. Even an unreal it must exist. Thus the two determinations of relativity passivity which can concern modes of being can on no account apply to being. The essay of the phenomenon cannot be its percepi. The transphenomenal being of consciousness cannot provide a basis for the transphenomenal being of the phenomenon. Here we see the error of the phenomenalists. Having justifiably reduced the object to the connected series of its appearances, they believe they reduce its being to the conception of its modes of being. That is why they have explained it by concepts which they have applied only to the modes of being, for they are pointing out the relations between the plurality of already existing beings. The ontological proof. Being is not being in its due. We believe we had dispense with granting transphenomenality to the being of the phenomenon because we have discoursed the transphenomenality of the being of consciousness. We are going to see, on the contrary, that this very transphenomenality requires that of the being of the phenomenon. there is an ontological proof to be derived not from the reflective cogito, but from the pre-reflective being of the percipients. This we shall now try to demonstrate. All consciousness is consciousness of something. This definitive of consciousness can be taken in two very distinct senses. Either we understand by this that the consciousness is constitutive of being of its object, or if it means that consciousness is in its inmost nature is a relation to the transcendent being. But the first interpretation of the formula destroys itself. To be conscious of something is to be conscious and confronted with a concrete and full presence, which is not consciousness. Of course, one can be conscious of an absence, but this absence appears necessarily as a precondition of the presence. As we have seen, consciousness is the real subjectivity and the impression of the subjective plenitude, but their subjectivity cannot go out of itself to possess a transcendent object in such a way to endow it with a plenitude of impressions. If then we wish at any price to make the being of phenomenon depend on consciousness, the object must be distinguished from consciousness not by its presence, but by its absence, not by its plenitude, but by its nothingness. If being belongs to consciousness, the object is not consciousness, but not to the extent that is not another being, but that it is non-being. This is the appeal to the infinite of which we spoke in the first section of this work. For Husserl, for example, the animation of the hyoleptic nucleus by the only intentions which can find their fulfillment, rung in the hyal is not enough to bring us outside of subjectivity. The truly objectifying intentions are empty intentions, those which aim beyond the present subjective appearance and the infinite totality of the series of appearances. We must further understand that the intentions aim at appearances which are never to be given at one time. It is an impossibility on principles for the terms of infinite series to exist and all at the same time before consciousness, along with the real absence of all these terms except for the one which is the real absence of all these terms except for the one which is the foundation of objectivity. If present these impressions, even in the infinite number, would dissolve in the subjective, is their absence which gives the objective being. Thus, being of the objective is pure non-being. It is defined as lack. It is the which escapes that which by definition will never be given, that which offers itself only in fleeting and successive profiles. But how can non-being be the foundation of being? How can the absent expected subjective become thereby the objective? A great joy which I hoped, for a grief which I dread, acquired from the fact of certain transcendence. This is, I admit, the transcendence and immanence does not bring us out of the subjective. It is true that things give themselves in profile, that it is simply by appearance, and it is true that each appearance refers to other appearances, but each of them is already in itself also alone a transcendent being, not a subjective material or impressionist plenitude of being, not a lack, a presence, not an absence. It is futile by sleight of hand to attempt to find the reality of the object of subjective plenitude of impressions in its objectivity on non-being. The objective will never come out of the subjective, nor the transcendent from immanence, nor being from non-being, but we are told Husserl, who defines consciousness precisely as transcendence. In truth he does. This is what he posits. This is his essential discovery, but from the moment he makes of the nomia an unreal correlative gnosis, a nomia whose essay is percepi, and he is totally unfaithful to his principle. Consciousness is consciousness of something. This means that transcendence is the constitutive structure of consciousness, and that is, the consciousness is born supported by a being which is not itself. This is what we call the ontological proof. No doubt someone will reply that the existence of the demand of consciousness does not prove that this demand ought to be satisfied, but the objection cannot be held up against an analysis of what Husserl calls intentionality, though to be sure he misunderstood its essential character. To say that the consciousness is consciousness of something means that the consciousness there is no being outside of the precise obligation of the revealing intuition of something, i.e. of some transcendent being. Not only does pure subjectivity, if initially given, fail to transcend itself to posit the objective of pure subjectivity disappears, what can properly be called subjectivity is consciousness of consciousness, but this consciousness of being consciousness must be qualified in some way, and it can be qualified only as revealing intuition, or it is nothing. Now, revealing intuition implies something revealed, Absolute subjectivity can be established only in the face of something revealed. Immanence can be defined only within the apprehension of the transcendent. It might appear that there is an echo here of Kant's refutation of problematic idealism, but we ought rather to think of Descartes. We are here on the ground of being, not of knowledge. It is not a question of showing that the phenomenon of the inner sense imply the existence of the objective and spatial phenomenon, but that consciousness implies in its being a non-conscious and transphenomenal being. In particular, there is no point in implying that in fact subjectivity implies objectivity, that it constitutes itself in constituting the objective. We have seen that the subjectivity is powerless to constitute the objectivity. To say that the consciousness is consciousness of something is to say that it must produce itself as a revelation of being, which is not it and which gives itself an already existing when consciousness reveals it. Thus we have left the pure appearance and have arrived at the full being. Consciousness is a being whose existence possesses its essence, and inversely, it is consciousness of being whose essence implies its existence, that it is, and which appears lays claim to being. Being is everywhere. Certainly, we could apply to consciousness the definition which Heidegger reserves for Dathan, and say that it is a being such that in its being is in question, but it would be necessary to complete the definition of the formulate. It is much more like consciousness as a being, where that which is being, it is being in the question so far as the being implies a being other than itself. We must understand that it is being, and no other than the transphenomenal being of phenomenon, and is not a nominal being which is hidden behind them. It is the being of this table and the package of tobacco on the lamp, more generally the being of the world which is implied by the consciousness. It requires simply that the being of that which appears does not exist only insofar as it appears, the transphenomenal being of that which exists where consciousness is itself in itself. Li, me, and soy. Being in itself. We can now form a new definitive consciousness conclusions about the phenomenon of being which we have considered in order to make the preceding observations. Consciousness is the revealed revelation of existence, and existence being appear before the consciousness of the foundation of their being. Nevertheless, the primary characteristic of being of the existent is never to reveal itself completely to consciousness. An existent cannot be stripped of its being. Being is the ever-present foundation of the existent. It is everywhere and it is nowhere. There is no being which is not the being of the certain mode of being, none which can be apprehended through the mode of being which manifests being unveils the same time. Consciousness can always be passed beyond the existence, not towards its being, but towards the meaning of its being. That is why we call it ontological, since a fundamental characteristic of its transcendence is to transcend the ontic towards the ontological. The meaning of the being of the existent is so far as it reveals itself to the consciousness as the phenomenal being. This meaning has itself a being, based on which manifests itself. It is from the point of view that we can understand the famous scholastic argument according to which there is a vicious circle in every proposition which concerns being, since any judgment about being already implies being, but in actuality there is no vicious circle, for it is not necessary again to pass beyond the being of the meaning towards its meaning. The meaning of the being is valid for the being of every phenomenon, including its own being. The phenomenon of being is not being, as we have already noted, but it indicates being and requires it, although in truth ontological proof, which we mentioned above, is not valid, especially for uniquity for it. There is one ontologically proof valid for the whole domain of consciousness. But this proof is sufficient to justify the information which we can derive from the phenomenon of being. The phenomenon of being, like every primary phenomenon, is immediately disclosed to consciousness. We have at each instant what Heidegger calls pre-ontological comprehension of it, that is, one which is not accompanied by a fixing in concepts and elucidation, for at present then there is no question of considering this phenomenon for the sake of trying to fix the meaning of being. We must observe always that this elucidation of the meaning of being is valid only for the being of the phenomenon, since the being of the consciousness is radically different from where its meaning was necessitated particular elucidation. In terms of the revealed revelation of another type of being for itself, li et rapport soi, which we should define later, which is opposed to the being in itself, literature and sort of the phenomenon. That is the elucidation of the meaning of the being in itself, which we are going to attempt here, can only be provisional. The aspects which we will reveal it imply other significations, which ultimately we must apprehend and determine. In particular, the preceding reflections have permitted us to distinguish two absolutely separate regions of being, the being of the pre-reflective cogito, the being of the phenomenon, but although the concept of being, this is the peculiarity of the being divided into the two regions within communication, we must nevertheless explain how much of these two regions can be placed under the same heading. That will necessitate the investigation of the two types of being, and it is evident that we cannot truly grasp the meaning of either one until we establish a true connection of the notion of being in general and the relations which unite them. We've indeed established by the examination of non-positional consciousness that the being of the phenomenon can on no account act upon consciousness. In this way, we have ruled out a realistic conception of the relations of the phenomenon with consciousness. We have shown also the examination of the spontaneity of the non-reflective cogito the consciousness cannot get out of its subjectivity. If the latter has been initially given, and that consciousness cannot act upon transcendent being, not without contradiction admit the passive elements necessary in order to constitute a transcendent being arising from them. Thus we have ruled over the ideal solution to the problem. It appears that we have barred all doors, and that we are now condemned to regard transcendent being and consciousness as two closed totalities without possible communication. It will be necessary to show that the problem allows a solution other than the realism of or idealism. A certain number of characteristics can be fixed on them immediately because for the most part they follow naturally from what we have just said. The clear view of the phenomenon of being has been obscured by a very common prejudice, which we shall call creationism. Since people suppose that God had given the being to the world, being always appeared tainted with a certain passivity, but a creation ex nihilo cannot explain that the coming to pass of being, for it is being always conceived in a subjectivity, even a divine subjectivity. It remains a mode of interest. Subjectivity being such subjectivity cannot even the representation of objectivity, and consequently it cannot even be effected with the will to create the objective. Furthermore, being it is suddenly placed outside the subjective by the fulguration of which Leibniz speaks, can only affirm itself as distinct from the opposed to its creator. Otherwise it dissolves in him the theory of the perpetual creation by removing from being that the Germans call Selbstverständlichkeit, makes it disappear in the divine subjectivity. Its being exists as over against God, its own support. It does not preserve the least trace of divine creation in a world. Even if it had been created, being in itself would be inexplicable in terms of creation, for it assumes its being beyond the creation. This is equivalent to saying that the being is uncreated, but we need not conclude that being creates itself, which would suppose that it's prior to itself. Being cannot be causa sui in the manner of consciousness. Being is itself. This means that it is neither passivity nor activity. Both of these notions are human and designate human conduct or the instrument of human conduct. There is activity when a conscious being uses means with an end in view. We call those objects passive on which our activity is exercised, inasmuch as they do not spontaneously aim at the end of which we make they serve. In a word, a man is active in the means which he employs are called passive. These concepts but absolutely lose all meaning. In particular, being is not active in order for there to be an end and a means, and there must be being for an even stronger reason. It cannot be passive, for in order to be passive it must be. The self-consistency of being is beyond the active as it is beyond the passive. Being is equally beyond the negation as being affirmation. Affirmation is the affirmation of something, that is, the act of affirming is distinguished from the thing affirmed. But if we suppose an affirmation is which the affirmed comes to the fulfillment of the affirming, it is confused with it. The affirmation cannot be affirmed owing to too much of plenitude and the immediate inherence of the noma in the gnosis. It is there that we find being. If we are to define it more clearly in connection with consciousness, it is the noma and the gnosis, that is, the inherence in itself, without the least distance from the point of view we should not call it eminence, for eminence, in spite of all connection with self, is still the side withdrawal which can be realized away from the self. But being is not a connection with itself. It is itself. It is an eminence which cannot realize itself, an information which cannot affirm itself, an activity which cannot act because it is glued to itself. Everything happens as if, in order to free from the affirmation of self, from the heart of being, there is necessary a decompression of being. Let us not, however, think that the being is merely one undifferentiated self-affirmation. The undifferentiated of the in itself is beyond an infinity of self-affirmations, inasmuch as the infinity of modes of self-affirming. We have summarized these first conclusions by saying that the being is in itself, that if being is in itself, this means that it does not refer to itself as self-conscious does. It is a self. It is itself so completely that the perpetual reflection which constitutes the self is dissolved with an identity. That is why being at the bottom beyond the self in our first formula can be only an approximation due to the requirements of language, in fact being an opera to itself precisely because it is filled with itself. This can be better expressed by saying that the being is what it is. This statement is in appearance strictly analytical. Actually, it is far from being reduced to that principle of identity, which is the unconditioned principle of all analytical judgments. First, the formula designates a particular region of being, that is, of being in itself. We shall see that the being for itself is defined, on the contrary, as being what is not, and not being what it is. The question here, there is a regional principle, and is such a synthetical. Furthermore, it is necessary to oppose this formula being in itself. It is what it is to what which designates the being of consciousness. The later, in fact, we shall see has to be what it is. This instructs us as to the special meaning which must be given to the is in the phrase being and what it is. From the moment that being exists, who have to be what they are, the fact of being what they are is no longer a purely axiomatic characteristic. It is a contingent principle of being in itself. In this sense, the principle of identity, the principle of analytical judgments, is also a regional synthetical principle of being. It designates the opacity of being in itself. This opacity has nothing to do with our position in relation to the in itself. It is not that we are obliged to apprehend it and to observe it because we are without. Being in itself has no within, which is opposed to do without, and which is analogous to a judgment, a law of consciousness of itself. The in itself has nothing secret. It is solid, massive. It is, in a sense, we can designate it as synthesis, but as the most indissoluble of all, a synthesis of itself with itself. The result is evidently that being is isolated in its being, that it does not enter into any connection for what is not itself, transition becoming anything which permits us to say that being is not yet what is will be, and that is already what it is not, and all the forbidden on principle for being is the being of becoming, and the due to this fact is the becoming beyond becoming. It is what it is. This means what that itself, it cannot even be what it is not. We have seen indeed that it is not encompass no negation. It is full positivity. It knows no otherness. It never posits itself as other than another being. It can support no connection with other. It is itself, indefinitely and exhausts itself and being. From the point of view we shall see later that it is not subject to temporality. It is when it gives away. One cannot even say that it no longer is, or at least a consciousness can be conscious of it as no longer being, precisely because consciousness is temporal. But being itself does not exist as a lack there was. The full positivity of being is reformed on it, its giving way. It was at present, other beings are, that is all. Finally, this will be our third characteristic, being in itself. This means that being can neither be derived from the possible nor reduced to the necessary. Necessity concerns the possible, nor reduced to the necessary. Necessity concerns the connection between the ideal propositions, but not that of the existence. An existing phenomenon can never be derived from another existent qua existent. This is what we shall call the contingency of being in itself. But neither can being in itself be derived from possibility. The possibility is a structure of the for itself. That is, it belongs to the other region of being. Being in itself is neither either be possible or impossible. This is what consciousness expresses in anthropomorphic terms by saying that being is superfluous, the trop. That is, that consciousness absolutely cannot derive being from anything, either from another being or from possibility or from a necessary law. Uncreated, without reason for being, without any constant connection with another being. A being in itself is the trop for eternity. Being is in itself. Being is what it is. These are the three characteristics which the preliminary examination of the phenomenon of being allows us to assign the being of the phenomenon. For the moment, it is impossible to push our phenomenon. For the moment, it is impossible to push our investigation further. This is not yet the examination of the investigation further. This is not yet the examination of the in itself, which is never anything but what it is, which will allow us to establish and to explain its relations with the for itself. Thus we have left appearances and have been led progressively to posit two types of being, the in itself and the for itself, concerning which we have as yet only superficial and incomplete information. A multitude of questions remain unanswered. What is the ultimate meaning of these two types of being? For what reasons do they both belong to being in general? And what is the meaning of that being, which includes within itself these two radically separated regions of being? If idealism and realism both fail to explain the relations which in fact unite these regions, which in theory are without communication, what other solution can we find for the problem, and how can the being of phenomenon be trans-phenomenal? It is to attempt to reply to these questions that I've written the present work. That was the introduction. Introduction.